Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database, and I write the weekly school shooting data analysis and reports Substack. You can subscribe to that for free. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about keeping kids safe while they're in schools. There are enormous investments into school security, into school safety, into violence prevention within the school environment. But when you look at the number of hours between kindergarten and 12th grade, a kid only spends about 10% of their time actually in the school building, which means that if you want to have a safe community and a safe environment, you've got to find ways to keep kids engaged and safe and connected with mentors far beyond the school day. And when we look at kind of the current political climate right now, there's a lot of discussion around cutting federal funding for education. And one of the biggest impacts of that is going to be cutting preschool programs and after school programs. And the ripple effect is going to be a reduction if you have limited dollars in after school activities and extracurriculars in sports. So what's going to happen is if we want kids to be engaged and safe and mentored once they leave the classroom for the day, we're going to need other community services to be doing that. So the guest today on the show is somebody I've known for about 15 years. And he decided that he wanted to create a nonprofit that gave kids a place where they could learn and grow and be mentored after school. But this just isn't any place. This is a nonprofit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy. And the founder of the Guardian Project, Ben Kovacs, is the guest on the show today. Ben, thank you so much for taking some time to talk about this.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see
Ben,
you.
I knew you in DC in the 2010s. You were always one step ahead of me. You always beat me up pretty well on the mats. But then you disappeared, and we kind of lost touch for a little while. But then all of a sudden, you're running this Guardian Oakland. And I didn't really know what it was, but like you're on TV, you're on Good Morning America talking about it. Like, what happened around 2015 where you decided to pivot in your life to running nonprofit jiu-jitsu academies?
Yeah, so I did start training in DC at the same school that you did, the Yamasaki Academy. And around 2010, I moved to California. I thought it was just going to be a year or two type thing. I ended up actually really liking it and just staying and never going home. So I'm still living in California. I got a job at Twitter pretty soon after I moved out there in 2013. And during that time, I met a bunch of really interesting people. I continued training jiu-jitsu in different schools. And I got this weird feeling of like, well, how is this sport that's really just mats and an instructor and training partners, how is it becoming an elitist sport where kids need $150, $200, $250 to train? So you're a single mom of 2 or 3 kids, or even if you're just, a core nuclear family, right, with 2 kids and 2 working parents, a lot of them that I talked to weren't able to afford to put their kids into jiu-jitsu because they were already paying for soccer or swimming or after school care or therapy or whatever it was. And it was basically becoming elitist. And I thought, this is crazy. Like, I grew up in a house where my parents actually couldn't really afford to pay for martial arts when I wanted to do karate as a kid. So I kind of felt that pain of like, it's a shame, how would my life have been different if I had that martial art growing up? And so I just thought, you know what, maybe there's a way we can do this differently. And of course, like most people, I would go to a gym and be like, wow, like the marketing's not good here. The mats aren't clean here. The instruction's not good enough here. And I'd always think, well, maybe I could do it a little bit better, a little bit different. Because when you think about how jiu-jitsu gyms start, it's almost always some guy who's good at jiu-jitsu, who gets his black belt, who learns from his teacher, and then just does things the way that his teacher did it, right? But that's not how intelligent people evolve. So many things in society we've improved and made better over time. So jiu-jitsu, it just didn't feel like to me was really improving. It wasn't like getting better, it was getting bigger. But a lot of gyms were just following the same path of that's how my instructor did it. So I just created a new model and said, what if we did a gym, we let adults pay whatever membership they wanted to pay, kind of like a donation-based membership, and then we gave kids free jiu-jitsu, and we didn't ask for any paperwork. We didn't ask them to jump through any hurdles. We didn't ask parents to bring their tax returns in, and we just said, let's see how it goes. So we did that in Oakland for a number of years, about 5 or 6 years, but I always wanted to build this more global model. And COVID sort of allowed us that break where I changed the model after COVID and said, you know what, there's 40, 50,000 jiu-jitsu gyms around the world. why are we running one program in Oakland? Why don't we go into other jiu-jitsu academies and bring our program there? They're already paying rent. They already have mats. They have instructors. They have resources. They have built-in volunteers in some cases. And so that's when Guardian really kind of blew up and expanded. And today we have 21 academies around the world serving about 500 kids every day to train jiu-jitsu for free.
And before we get into, you've got Guardian in Ethiopia and Peru and Mongolia and Mexico, and then here in the US in some of the cities where, kids really need resources in LA and Oakland and Baltimore. Why is jujitsu even important in these places? And first, I think a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are teachers or educators, are parents, and they, see people dressed in pajamas wrestling around, and they think it's karate. Like, what is, in your opinion, what is Brazilian jiu-jitsu? What should the lay person think about it, and what it means for a child?
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of ways to answer this question, but I would say that at its core, excuse me, at its core, jiu-jitsu is like the most real fighting you can get without the danger of getting like brain damage and hurt. And that's what makes it so special. And what I mean by that is if you do boxing or you do karate or you do some of these sports that require getting punched in the face, that's a tough sell for most parents, rightfully, including myself. Like, I don't necessarily want my 7-year-old son or my 12-year-old son getting punched in the head to learn how to fight. Jiu-jitsu allows you to actually go 100%, and it allows you to practice at full speed as if you're simulating a fight, but there's no punching in the head, there's no kicking, you're not losing your teeth, you're not getting brain damage, because the end of a jiu-jitsu match is either the time runs out or someone taps. And so the risk of injury is no different than soccer or swimming or baseball. Of course, fluke accidents can happen. Someone could hurt their knee, or they could get bumped in the face or whatever and get a bloody lip. But for the most part, it's no different than playing any of the core sports that are kind of societally accepted. So that's what really makes it beautiful. And I think that's why people get really addicted to it. And it allows them to train much longer in life too, right? It's not just the kid, it's extending that journey. And that's so important for what we do, because as you know, most after school programs stop when the education stops. So maybe you have a great basketball program that you're in high school and it keeps you grounded and your coach is your mentor. And then all of a sudden you play your last game when you're 18 years old. And now you're basically searching for a purpose because you're going to basketball practice every day. That was your community. Those were your friends. That's kind of what happened to me, to be honest, in high school. Then I was like, well, what do I do next? I'm not going to play in college anymore. I'm not going to, do so. Then you resort to drinking, you resort to gambling, you resort to potentially bad habits because now you're this 18-year-old, in my case, man, and you don't have your outlet anymore for it. And the beautiful thing is, about jiu-jitsu is not only is it safe for the most part, but it allows you to basically continue all through life, like tennis or golf or some of these other sports, but with a much more like physical outlet to it. So yeah, I mean, obviously you could talk about, the benefits of jiu-jitsu, but to me, those are like the core aspects. It never stops, and you're really simulating a fight without the risk of most fighting damage that you would have in other fighting sports.
Yeah, it's a much more technical applied version of wrestling, which almost every high school has a wrestling team somewhere around the country. So we've decided wrestling is a safe, acceptable thing for both boys and girls to do in schools now. You have very high injury rates in both football and gymnastics, but those are widely accepted as school sanctioned, or sometimes the biggest activities at a lot of schools. So this is kind of a safer, more evolved version of things that are already happening at schools that are sanctioned. One of the more unfortunate things, and it's in places like Baltimore and LA and Oakland and really every school across the country, is there are unsanctioned fights that are taking place in schools every single day. There are kids that are getting into fights in the hallway, getting into fights in the classroom. So if kids are going to fight anyway, it may be a good idea to give them a way to resolve conflicts in a structured and a safe environment, because I think that that's one of the biggest missing pieces in education right now. Is kids have all of these different challenges that have been magnified in a lot of ways from what we faced in schools 20 years ago, but they don't have any outlet or structured way to be able to learn how to resolve those conflicts. And I think that that's been something that's led to the escalation of gun violence at schools. The number of shootings on school campuses have 10x'd in the last decade. The majority of them are disputes that are escalating into shootings. And so if kids are getting into conflicts, those conflicts are getting worse, they're turning deadly. It means that we need to change a paradigm somewhere and change the way that kids are thinking about resolving conflicts. And I think that's kind of at the heart of Guardian, because you're looking for some of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable kids in their communities and giving them a place where they can learn and be mentored.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I have so many thoughts on this. I'll try to keep it concise, but the first thing is human nature is human nature, right? You can't change the way that, a 15, 17-year-old, 18-year-old kid going through puberty in a school with 200 of their classmates that they're trying to impress. There's just going to be conflicts. You're going to have bullies, you're going to have nice kids, you're going to have kids that want to fight, that don't want to fight, that are trying to impress girls, whatever it is, right? And when people have this rebuttal like, well, kids just shouldn't fight, or they shouldn't be violent, or they shouldn't get in altercations, or they should just all be nice to each other, it's like a little bit of course, right? Like, that's an easy answer, but it's unfortunately just not the reality, right? That's not the world that they live in. So I think the first point you're making is that we have to address the reality that conflicts are going to happen and have a better way to resolve them. I view jiu-jitsu actually as a last resort. I mean, I've been training for 19 years. I've gotten in exactly 0 fights outside the gym, and I've had my opportunities too. But the first thing jiu-jitsu teaches you when you walk in a gym is that you're not that tough for the most part. I went into jiu-jitsu. I was pretty good playing basketball and other sports, and I thought, I'm going to crush these guys. Look at these guys. Like, look at this 130-pound guy. Look at this girl. Look at this, whatever. And I thought, and all of a sudden I'm getting twisted into a pretzel by a 135-pound guy that looks like an accountant. And I'm like, what's going on here, right? Like, maybe I shouldn't be fighting people. Maybe I'm not that tough, right? So that was the first thing, right? Whereas before I'd go to a bar, I'd be hanging out with my friends, and I'd be thinking like, oh, maybe I could fight, and then you realize like, actually, I'm not a fighter. So I think that's like the first step, is this reality of like, I'm not as tough as I think I am. And I don't maybe want to get in these fights, and I don't need to test myself on the street and get my head bashed in, because I just learned in the gym that I'm not that tough. The second thing it does is it provides a community. So what we see at a lot of our schools is there might be a kid getting bullied who's training at the gym, and then those other kids step up and start protecting that kid, right? Naturally. And all of a sudden, a bully doesn't really want to fight 15 kids from a gym that are protecting the kid, right? And this happened in our Peru Academy. One of our kids was deformed, had some, pretty serious like health issues. It was just a miracle kind of to get him on the mat and get his body moving and get him training. But, he was getting picked on in school. And the kids basically, once he started training, didn't see him as just the kid to pick on in school. They were like, oh, he's one of us now. So they protect him from the bullies. And so there's so many things that go into this. And of course, if the fight does actually happen, the last point is jiu-jitsu. If you're good enough at jiu-jitsu, as you know, you can end the fight without physically hurting someone. You can choke them and they wake up and they're like, wait, what just happened? You don't have to break their face. You don't have to curb stomp them. You don't have to, put them in the hospital. You can stop a fight if you're good without like a lot of physical harm, police getting involved, all the things that are going to happen if you take it to that next level. So, I think whether it's just preventing, which is what we want to do most of the time, getting people to walk away, or whether it's actually like finishing that fight as a last case resort in a more empathetic way, those are all good things. So I think sometimes you trigger people when you say like, we should teach kids to fight. And, I saw you post about this on LinkedIn the other day, and people started to say, oh, we can't be teaching the kids to fight. But I think what you really mean is like, let's teach kids not to fight. Last case resort, if they do fight, let's make sure that it's the safest way possible, because we just know things are going to happen.
Once you go into an academy, you get on the mat. For anybody who's never been to a jiu-jitsu class before, you don't pick your partners. You don't really decide what's going to happen that day. You do a warm up, you start working through some techniques, and then you pair off with people and you start sparring with them. And in that, you're in a competition that's really entirely unstructured aside from the rules. There's not somebody watching over you. It's up to the two partners to go back and forth to play off each other until somebody gets to a choke or a submission, or the time runs out and you move on to the next partner. And part of what that does is kids that are having a little issue with each other, this kid who bumped me in the hallway, this kid who keeps looking at me the wrong way, this kid who, keeps trolling my social media status. all of those things might be something that escalates into the hallway, into that kid looks at you the wrong way again. And next thing you know, you're throwing fists. Both of the kids get suspended or expelled. Now they're out of the school community. You're not in the school community. Not graduating high school is the strongest correlate to being a lifetime offender and having multiple incarcerations. So just that little set of kind of BS interactions can really set somebody on the path of being a lifelong criminal. But if you're in a structured
Hmm.
environment where a couple times a week you're wrestling and fighting and trying to choke and going back and forth with your partners
Oh, I
in a
really
really
understand. Look,
physical manner,
I
then you're not going to care as much about these little things. It happens for adults as well. I think about in my 20s, I probably would have been fired from some of the jobs that I had because I had some of the most annoying supervisors that were, constantly micromanaging, but their little comments or their emails didn't bother me because there's a bigger picture. There's a bigger conflict. There's a real struggle that you've been in. So with kind of the format of Guardian, say we're thinking about the Baltimore or the Oakland location, a kid is in high school, they leave their school, they walk to their Guardian gym. What does that afternoon look like for them once they get there?
The first thing I would say is that all of our academies are different, right? Everybody has a different program. Some of our academies have a paid kids program and they fold our program on top of it. So, they're mixing sort of paid kids and free kids in. Other schools like Baltimore or Peru, they don't have a paid program at all. It's just 100% sort of like free program. The nonprofit is the gym. It's there's nothing else, right? So they have different class schedules, they have different ages. We don't tell every one of our academies this is how you have to do it. We say, hey, like, you do it how you want. If you want to have 5 classes a week, great. If you want to have 10 classes a week, great. If you want to have one kid's class, great. If you want to have 3 kids classes for different ages, great. Like, let us know how we can support you. We're sort of like the brand and the umbrella and the help and the money that sits on top, right, of them executing. Um, so I can't really tell you, hey, it's like the same at every academy. But the main thing is that the kids have a certain amount of training every week where they can go to, and then most of our gyms have some sort of like extra program, meaning like maybe they have a therapist, maybe they have a food program. Like Carlos, who's a mutual friend of ours who runs our Baltimore Academy, he also owns a Mexican restaurant, so he gets burritos and then he feeds the kids that need food burritos, because what we found is a lot of kids that were coming to
Not just
train
a
didn't have
Mexican
food
restaurant, a
at
James
home.
Beard award-winning restaurant. So let's foot stamp Carlos.
Yeah,
He's done some
exactly.
incredible things in Baltimore.
Exactly. So yeah, it's like everything's a little different, everything has its own flavor, but the main thing is just giving them that consistency, right? And you have to remember one of the beautiful things about jiu-jitsu is it's rain or shine 365. So when you play baseball, it's seasonal, basketball seasonal, football seasonal. If you play tennis outdoors, you can't play when it's raining. So a lot of these kids, they fall into bad habits when they're not in a season for their sport, or it's raining or there's a snowstorm. And so the nice thing about jiu-jitsu is basically you can train any day. It's always indoors. It's always covered. It's always heated or cool or whatever. So there's no real excuse. And as you know, like that's the big thing with kids. It's like they need that consistency. They need to know, hey, every day I can go to this gym Monday through Friday at 4 and the teacher will be waiting. I can talk to them if I need help. We find that our teachers really become almost like these de facto therapists for a lot of the kids. You don't want to go tell your like 6th grade math teacher some intimate detail about your life, but you walk into a gym and you see this big strong man or woman who's teaching with a black belt on. You look up to them almost right away and you're like, this is a person I want to be like. And then they feel more comfortable confiding in them and telling them what's going on in their life. And one of the interesting things we hear a lot is a kid will come into the gym and they'll be crying. They'll be like, hey, something happened at home, my dad's beating my mom, you know my little brother's doing XYZ. And they're really upset. And then after class, the teacher will be like, hey, like, do you want to talk about it? And they'll be like, no, I'm fine now. It's like the class was the therapy, right? Getting on the mats, moving their body, fighting and other kids, wrestling, grappling, choking, kind of makes them forget their problems, to the point that you made earlier a little bit. Not completely, but it's like you can't be on your phone while you train. It's like riding a motorcycle and doing jujitsu are kind of the two things I found where you're like really completely focused, right? You're not texting while you're driving the motorcycle, and you're not texting while some guy's trying to choke you from behind. And there's very few things in life where you can't do that. Almost everything, like if you're golfing, you can be on your phone, right? If you're, you know, doing all these other sports, like they're filming, you're lifting weights at the gym, people are filming themselves now and they're on their social media. And it's like, you're not really getting away from this thing that you actually, your brain needs a break from. And I think that's one of the real superpowers of the
Yeah, I think
sport.
one of the only other sports like that, which is my other big sport, is surfing. Because thank goodness phones
Mm-hmm.
still are not water and salt proof. So that's the one space where you can go for a couple hours and you don't get bothered at all. It was an interesting point that you made about how the traditional kind of school-based sports, most of them are seasonal. But in addition to being seasonal, most of them actually have a lot of academic requirements, which means that you need to have a certain GPA to do this. If you have disciplinary issues, you're going to be excluded from being permitted to do sports. In some, you need parental consent. So either if your parent doesn't want you to do it, maybe they're abusive, maybe they're absent, maybe you don't have a parent, you wouldn't be able to participate in some of these things. And then there's also entry and equipment fees, which a lot of kids may or may not be able to afford. So I think what's interesting about your model is a kid who probably needs structure and an athletic environment and a coach the most is a kid that in the public education system or in the intramural sports system is going to have the least access to that type of activity. I think people don't realize how cheap jujitsu is compared to most of these other sports that we just take as a constant.
I mean, this is one of my pet peeves, to be honest, is, when I started the first Guardian 10 years ago, people were like, well, how are you going to make sure that the parents like actually should be in this program and they can't afford it? Like, are you going to ask them for their tax returns and documentation and whatever? That was one big thing. And the second thing they'd say is, how do you, how do you know they're not going to fight in schools and all these other things? And there was all these sort of like complaints about what could go wrong instead of what could go right. And what I look at it is, and I say, why in the hell would I ask parents to bring their tax returns in? Because who's not going to bring their tax returns in? The person who's here, illegally cleaning houses or working at a restaurant or something who A, doesn't even know what I'm talking about, and B, doesn't have that proof, and they're afraid that, if they turn in certain paperwork that, that could work against them somehow, right? So we just had this open door policy of like, all you have to do is show up with a parent, signed form. We didn't even meet half the parents, to be honest, in the first Guardian half the time. It was like some kid who was 16 would come in with a form. I'm sure half the time it was like they were signing the form. But, we wanted to make it as open as possible and like reduce those barriers from cost and paperwork and, all the things that would trip up like the most lowest income students who needed it the most. Second thing is, to your point, the kid that needs to be in the jiu-jitsu program more than anyone is the kid who's getting detention, who's failing out of his subjects or her subjects, like not going to school consistently. In most programs, to your point, they would stop that. They'd say, oh, this person doesn't have the attendance to go to the after school program. This person doesn't have the grades to play football. And it's like, are you insane? This 16-year-old kid who's not going to school, who's failing, the one thing that's like keeping him out of a gang is playing on the football team, and you're going to take that away from him because of some bullshit, rule or some theory in your head that like all kids should be getting A's and B's. Like, you're an absolute idiot if you think that is like the best way to do it. And I'm so passionate that that is not the right way to do it. That, I mean, that just to me is just absolutely crazy talk to like limit kids who are doing worse to not play in these
So,
sports after
do you
school.
have any examples where you've really seen a kid change, where they were the kid that was having the behavioral issues, that was acting out, that had the worst scores, was right on the edge of flunking out or getting kicked out of school, and then being involved with a place like Guardian completely changed their life?
I mean, I have so many examples of kids changing in small and big ways. I would say I have less examples specifically about grades because, like, again, like that was never our focus. Like, we wouldn't even really ask about grades. So, and we didn't really interact a lot with like their teachers for the most part. Like, every once in a while, maybe a teacher would recommend to a parent or a kid that they should come to our gym, but like that wasn't our core focus, right? Um, with a big thing for us was finding these kids who were going to enter gang life. So, obviously when you're a 15-year-old kid and you live in a rough area, maybe you don't have parents at home. The parents don't have any money. Maybe you don't have a father, whatever it is. It's a very tempting thing to see like a bunch of grown men that have money in their pocket that look tough and act tough. Maybe they rule the neighborhood, and you're like, I want to join that, right? And so one of our best stories was a kid who he was not a very in shape kid. He was one of our first students actually at Guardian in Oakland, and he would come all the time to the gym. And some days he would train, some days he was just kind of hanging out, and he would just sort of, it was almost like a social thing for him. It was pretty quiet. And we didn't find out till like 4 or 5 years later that he was going to join a gang like the week he started at Guardian. And I don't think this kid would have made it very far, to be honest, in a gang. He was not like a super tough kid. But over time, he had struggled with weight problems and other things. I'm sure he wasn't eating healthy at home and didn't have access to like, good nutritional diet and all those things. But fast forward to today, he's actually working at a jiu-jitsu gym. I think he's a purple belt now in jiu-jitsu. He's competing in tournaments, and he's a girlfriend for the first time. And so, you kind of saw this progression from, 8, 9 years, whatever it was ago, of kind of a really chubby, out of shape kid coming into the gym, was about to join a gang, probably would be certainly dead or in jail by now, almost 99% chance, to now having sort of a successful, look, he's not like the next Elon
Well, let's hope
Musk,
not.
right? He's not curing cancer or anything like that. But like you know, he's he's got a pretty healthy, happy life for the most part, like significantly better than where he was. And he has options. He's thinking about what he wants to do for a career now. He wants to be a firefighter or become an electrician. He's got good options on the table. So things like that are, the success stories that we point to and that we see a lot. Another kid, to give you a story. He was again in Oakland, and he would come to the gym a lot, and then all of a sudden one day kind of stopped coming for a while. So Calder, who works with me at Guardian and kind of runs our programs, he reached out to the kid's mom and just was like, hey, what's going on with this kid? Why is he not coming in? And the mom said, you know what, tomorrow, like I'm going to make sure he comes to the gym tomorrow. And he was kind of like one of those kids, going through that puberty, 15, 16 years old. You could just tell he's like, I don't need to go wrestle today. I'm going to go chase girls and stand on the corner or whatever. That day that he came to the gym for the first time in a couple of weeks, all of his buddies got shot on the street corner. One of them died. The rest went to the hospital. He had guaranteed hospital or death if one of the two, if he would have not come to the gym that day. So, we're just an alternative, right? We're an alternative for standing around. And that's unfortunately what we see in America is the kids who come to these gyms in the US, especially when we ask them what they would be doing if they weren't at the gym that day, the answer is almost always nothing. I would be at Starbucks. I would be on my phone. I would be hanging around, or I'd be playing video games. Those are like the four things we would hear consistently. It was never like, oh, I'd be going to this other program or I'd be playing this other sport. It was like we're competing with apathy and nothing. It was like our competition to get the kids in the gym. And, we would lose a lot, to be clear, right? Like a lot of kids choose Starbucks, right? A lot of kids choose video games. Like we weren't winning all the time, but the way I look at it is like not, hey, we're here to indoctrinate everyone with jujitsu. We're just here to say we're open. We're friendly. It's kind of like a restaurant that has a gay flag, a gay pride flag on the wall. They're not saying you have to be gay to come to the restaurant. They're just saying, hey, we're open. This is something that we're, supportive of, whatever, like you can feel safe here. And that's kind of like the way I look at Guardian, right? It's like, hey, we're here. We're a safe place. If you can't afford to train, you can come in and talk to us. We're here to help you. We're here to grow the sport of jiu-jitsu in a positive way. Only a small fraction of kids are going to choose that, but at least they have a choice, right? So the 1%, the 2%, the 5% who are like, yeah, I want to do that. I don't want to play video games. I want to better my life. I want to be healthier. I want to be tougher. All these things, we're here for you,
And
right?
it's kind of that level of simplicity that can make such a big difference. I wrote an article a month or two ago about applying first principles thinking. And I know you're a Bay Area guy, so that resonates. But for anyone in the audience who isn't familiar, it's the idea that if you have complex problems, you keep digging down to the core of them until you get to the first principles, which are the absolute truths that have to be present for that problem or that situation to exist. And thinking about either community violence prevention or school shooting prevention, since this is the Back to School Shootings podcast, we got to talk about this at some point. But the first principles of gun violence or a school shooting are that someone has access to a gun. And in places like Oakland and Baltimore and Los Angeles, pretty much any community around the country, like a kid can get a gun pretty easily. Then you need to have access to the school. And every kid who's going into and out of a school is allowed to access the building. we are spending billions of dollars trying to detect a gun or trying to secure that building against somebody with a gun, but it's really not working because there are kids getting arrested with guns inside schools every day. And the third part of the first principles, so it's getting a gun, having access to the school, is having motivation to harm someone. And we spend a ton of downstream effort after somebody already has the motivation trying to determine through a threat assessment if they're going to carry out violence or not. But what a place like Guardian, or what a program like Guardian, or teaching jujitsu, or teaching discipline and mentoring, is you start changing that motivation. So the simplest part applying first principles is if you just change somebody's motivation towards violence, then you don't have to do any of these downstream, really expensive, and generally ineffective, other solutions to this problem. And I think that that's something, Ben, that we talked about in the past that kind of drives you crazy. Is it is such a minimal investment to set up a gym, to put some mats down, to get some uniforms for the kids to wear, to get a restaurant to donate some lunch, to have an extra space with tables where they can work on their homework. That costs almost nothing compared to the amount of money that we put into security and threat assessment and gang enforcement and incarceration. And so, like, have you ever kind of crunched these numbers to see like how much cost savings simple programs like yours have?
Well, before I get crazy and piss off a bunch of your listeners, let me just start by saying that we're not perfect. We don't solve every problem for every kid, right? We have dozens of kids who used to come to the gym in Oakland that we now see on Instagram and stuff flashing guns that are 15, 16, 18, whatever years old. They've fallen into that life. Like, we are not 100% success rate, to be clear, at all. So I just want to make that point that, like, jiu-jitsu doesn't just magically come in, you get the free jiu-jitsu and all of a sudden you're free from gangs, you're happy, you're nice to, your boyfriend or girlfriend, like you're nice to your parents. Like, it just doesn't, it's not like that. It's an incremental helpful tool in the tool belt, right? As you know, it's not everything. So I just want to be fair before I say what I'm going to say. So California in particular, I don't know about the other states, spends about $100,000 a year to incarcerate a prisoner. Of course, that number doesn't take into account the violence or the pain and suffering that maybe they've caused on a victim of a homicide or a violent crime as well, right? That's just the pure cost to like lock them up, feed them, pay the guards every year, whatever else goes into that system. In the U.S., we're probably averaging anywhere from like $50 to $100 a month per student to be able to train them in a gym. Sometimes it can be a little bit less if the gym's really efficient, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize, like, if we can help 10, 20% of the kids through a program like ours stay healthy, get a job, be a productive member of society instead of being incarcerated for the next 30, 50, 100 years, the ROI is 100x not doing that, let alone the reduced pain and suffering for both the incarcerated party and the victims that they're going to have over time. So it's pretty obvious. Now, we're not, as a society, good at preventative maintenance, right? Climate change is not really taken super seriously by a lot of people until all of a sudden the water's now up on their dock at their lake house and taking over the house, right? Until then, we don't do stuff. Air pollution, China had to basically change it to how many people were dying every year. They couldn't say, hey, this is what the future is going to look like. They had to really change that narrative to get people to see today. We're not good as humans at fixing a problem that's 10 years away. We're good at fixing problems that are like right in front of us today. So it's just a little bit of a mindset shift and an investment. And it's something that I think the U.S. struggles with in part because of our election cycles. Everyone's trying to get elected for the next, 2, 4, or 6 years. Whereas like a communist company like China is planning 40 years ahead, right? They're planning their nuclear energy. So if we could adopt like a little bit more of a mindset, like long term, I think that would be really helpful to make those decisions. But it's not necessarily always practical, right? If that makes sense.
So then, with your nonprofit model, I think what is different about this from a traditional intramural sports model or the traditional jiu-jitsu academy structure is that it's much more accessible and it's much more scalable because you can do this in an environment where you don't need as much capital. How do you see this model kind of expanding and being able to replicate in more communities, even if people, we want people to have, you know, a decade long or a multi-decade vision of like, what can we do for the youth in the next generation to be better than they are in this generation? But we have to take little small efforts to get there. Like, how is this a model that's really applicable and scalable, and anybody that has interest can essentially make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm speaking specifically to jujitsu now, not all sports, but you know, the way I look at it is just sort of math to some extent. So we have about 15 or 16 schools in the United States, and about 5 or 6 internationally, depending on when this podcast airs. Um, there's 43,000 jiu-jitsu gyms and jiu-jitsu clubs, grappling clubs in the United States alone, as far as the numbers that I can see from my research, and it's a fast-growing sport. So the way I look at it is I go, okay, well, there's 43,000 distribution centers that are already there, that already have mats, that already have an instructor, that already have students. So we're like not even like scratching the surface with 15 or 16 of those 43,000 to be able to start to now go and expand into all of those other places. So if we could just get, you know, 1% of the gyms to pick up the Guardian program and say, hey, like I've got extra mat space. I love what you're doing. I'm going to allow 10 kids to train here on scholarship for free as, you know, part of this, right? That's a lot that we can do with like a existing distribution point, for lack of a better word, with those gyms existing. The second thing we're doing is for those gyms that don't want to have the kids program because maybe they say, look, like I can't risk cannibalizing my paid kids program. That's how I feed my family, or my gym's too small, or I'm already full, whatever it is, that's fine. We're saying to them now, hey, why don't you pick another Guardian Academy? So let's say you're in Monterey, California. You know, there's a heavy Mexican population there. You know, they've had trouble getting kids to the gym to run the Guardian program due to transportation and logistics. Why don't you sponsor our academy in Culiacan, Mexico? And when people come in for open mat or drop in, instead of saying like, oh, you got to pay me $25 for a drop in, or instead of telling them, hey, don't worry about it, it's cool, like don't worry about it, just say, hey, we're partnered with the Guardian program. If you want to make a donation for your drop in today, here's a QR code, here's a Venmo, whatever, go ahead and make that donation, right? So that makes the school look good because it shows that they have a bigger mission, that they're not just like, oh, give me $20, I'm trying to make a quick $20 off you, or $50 or whatever it is. um, they're basically leveraging Guardian to both help kids through the Guardian program, but also make themselves look more magnanimous and more like they're pushing the sport of jiu-jitsu forward. So in other words, it's a win-win that we're creating with the academies for those that want to participate. And so those are the two ways that we're really kind of like growing and expanding. You know, we're also now starting to partner with a lot of the biggest names in the sport. So, you know, we've started working with the UFC Foundation recently this year. We are working with Craig Jones Invitational for being kind of like the main charity partner for 2025 for what they're doing in August. So we're getting a lot more people. You know, we're getting sponsored by Sanibel and Show You Roll, two of the biggest apparel companies in jiu-jitsu. So we're starting to make like a lot more, I would say, you know, inroads, because people are now seeing like, wow, like Guardian's already doing this. They're an easy button for us. We can get content with them. We can get impact with them, and we can get tangible things that we can point to and show where our money's going, meaning like we're building schools, we're putting mats in. A lot of the nonprofits out there, it's like you just give them money and you don't really know what happens. I'm sorry to say that. Like, I don't want to be too critical, but like there's a lot of shit going on in the nonprofit world that is just an absolute joke. You know, it's just like somebody paying themselves a big salary, funneling money from one foundation to one nonprofit back to another nonprofit. Then all of a sudden, you know, 80% of the money is stripped out for whatever the end cause was supposed to be. And it's like, I don't know, like to me, this is something I do for free. This is something I am passionate about. And I'm not saying everybody can work for free, but it's like, I think people need to be much more careful about like where they donate their money, because you could donate to something that has a lasting impact, where you teach a man to fish type thing and like have a 20, 30, 50, 100-year impact on the world, or you could just kind of flush money down the toilet, which unfortunately a lot of the
Yeah, and
nonprofit
I
world
mean,
is.
just thinking about the numbers that you're putting out, like this doesn't need to solely be a nonprofit donor mission either, because there are federal, state, and local tax dollars that have real costs that are attached to the criminal justice system. with that figure of it's $100,000 a year to have somebody incarcerated, that's also not counting the cost of the policing that got them there, the correction, the criminal justice system, the court system, to have lawyers and appeals, whatever else, to when they're actually incarcerated, to then when they leave, they are going to have significantly lower earnings for the rest of their life because they've been incarcerated. So if you think of that cost of $50 per kid per month, it's roughly $500 a year. Apply that, to 20 kids. If there's one of those 20 kids that was going to end up incarcerated, that prevents, you're already at a break even. But if you're looking at, some areas of the country, there's much higher than a 1 in 20 rate of at-risk youth that end up incarcerated. So we're actually seeing this as something that is saving people tax dollars. Have you ever thought about, or do you see any way that something like Guardian and structured jujitsu education that's blending, your external gym with actually being part of a school's curriculum? Uh, because this happens. Like, for example, very few schools have a swimming pool at the school, but you still have a swim team that takes place other places. You have golf teams where they're a school golf team, but they're playing on public golf courses. Like, there are ways where schools already are blending with external resources. Have you ever thought about your program being, incorporated right into, say, a charter school?
um, we've thought about it. I think, to be honest, we've been pretty historically unsuccessful with like getting partnerships at sort of the school level, at certainly getting like grants and stuff like that. I think that one of the tough things about the nonprofit world, and again, this is going to be probably hard for some people to hear without thinking I'm being bitter or whatever, but the truth is that the people who get all the money in that world know how to play the system. They have professional fundraisers. Maybe they came from like that industry. They have friends in that position, whatever it is. We don't really have that experience, right? We started as like mission first, like we're jiu-jitsu people. We want to start this program. We believe in it. We weren't we've never had a full-time dedicated fundraising person or a grant writer or whatever. When we have tried to do those things, and we have tried over time, we've just been completely unsuccessful. So we've kind of went back to our bread and butter, which is like getting, middle class to wealthier jiu-jitsu folks to basically say, jiu-jitsu's changed my life. How can I, donate money to a program that's going to kind of give that next generation the same hope? And so, yeah, I mean, I would love all those things, but I'm not quite sure sometimes how to cut through the mess and the bureaucracy to get there. And I think because we don't fit like so neatly in a bucket, we're basically asking people to take that one extra leap of faith that I think is hard for them. And you don't get fired for buying IBM back in the day, was always the saying, right? I don't think you get fired for donating to the school shooter foundation or whatever, things there are. It's like everybody wants to stop school shootings. You're going to do education and advocacy to stop school shootings. Like any administrator, bureaucrat, whatever, can probably wrap their head around that. Whereas I'm going in saying, if you give kids and teach them how to fight safely, we're going to have less violence and less incarceration. And they're like, ooh, I'm just some guy, girl, whatever, filling out paperwork here, try to keep my job. I'm not really sure I want to put my neck on the line for the fighting program. And so I think that scares a lot of people away in that world. Whereas, of course, the 45-year guy who trains jiu-jitsu and like is a hedge fund manager or whatever is like, oh, great, here's 50 grand. Like, I love jiu-jitsu. If I can help a kid, with their program, that's what happens, right? So anyway, I don't know. I'm not trying to sound bitter about it, but it's like we've just for 10 years gotten zero money from the state, from the city, for the federal government. We had our gym in Oakland. In 7 years, whatever we had that gym open, we didn't have a single person. We didn't have a city councilman, a mayor, a school board member. We didn't have anybody come to the gym. It's just like, it's like insane to me, right? Like they miss, I think, the big opportunity of what there is here to transform these kids' lives through this, right? Through this consistent experience that they have after school every day. And yeah, so we kind of,
I mean, that's understandable. And it's a tough environment to break into. And I mean, it's down to like, nobody's done a first principles analysis of these things. Nobody's looked at a lot of status quo elements are making problems worse, not making them better. there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that active shooter drills and lockdown drills actually teach kids how to be a school shooter, and they do very little to
Mhm.
help or prevent one, while they traumatize every single kid in the school. So the schools become these just churning institutional mechanisms of whatever's the status quo just gets repeated over and over and over without anybody doing a real investigation of what are the root causes here and what are out of the box ways to address them. So
Well, also, I mean, look, I mean, this is what's going to probably make a few people mad. Almost nothing is working in some of these communities. Like in Baltimore, I got in an argument with a friend today. Like I'm probably a little more conservative than a lot of the audience. I don't think I'm like a right wing nut or anything, but more like a libertarian, I guess, type mindset. And I got in an argument with a friend, and we were talking about like the defunding of the schools, right? And my argument was, could Baltimore public schools be any worse than they are today? There's like zero children. I think it's literally 0%, less than 1% are reading at their grade level of what they're supposed to read at. The attendance is abysmal. Um, there's like no air conditioning in the hot months or whatever in the school, so people don't want to go to school because they're basically like roasting to death being in the school. There's violence in the school, so a lot of kids don't want to go to school because of the fear of violence. And my mentality, again, thinking from like a first person principle, as you brought up earlier, is like, while this guy was kind of whining to me about how we're going to screw everything up, I was like, could it be any worse than what it is today in the Baltimore public schools? Could it be worse? I mean, of course, you could say, yeah, there could be more school shootings, there could be, more violence, whatever, but like, it's pretty freaking bad. And I'm kind of hopeful that we can start to like go back and almost start some of this over and have an honest conversation of like, this isn't working. It hasn't been working for generations. We continue to kind of vote for the same thing, make the same decisions. Like, how do we incorporate these radically new programs in that could seem a little scary to the status quo? But again, I don't think we have a ton to lose in a lot of these schools, especially these public schools in these areas that are just really, really not doing well last year or the year before, but for generations of failure now, right? And I call what we're doing at Guardian is oftentimes I call it breaking the cycle of failure. And I coined this term when we were in Peru because we started talking to these kids and these parents who were 12, 14, 15 years old. And what we realized is that all these kids grew up with hope. They want to be something. They want to be better than their parents. They want to make money. They want to be happy. They want to do all these things. But all of a sudden, they turn 13, 14 years old, and the girls are getting pregnant. The boys are getting into drugs. The parents are forcing them to go drive a taxi for $5 a day or $2 a day, whatever they can make because they need income to survive. And that culture of failure just rinses and repeats. And so what we're trying to do is come in there and say, whoa, 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 whoa. Between 12 and 16, whatever that critical age is, 18, we can come in here and we can actually be an alternative. You can work at the gym. We'll pay you the $2 a day to show up here and clean the mats. You don't have to drive a taxi, right? We'll get you healthy. We'll do all these, we'll teach you English, whatever the thing is that we're doing, in that school. And we can help you just in a small way, maybe prevent that cycle from happening. Because if we can give you an alternative to not drive that taxi, right? Or give you an alternative to not get pregnant, like that might be the thing that breaks your cycle of failure and changes the whole future of your family versus just falling into it. And I'm afraid in some of, especially these inner city schools in the US, we are just perpetuating the cycle of failure over and over and over again. While everybody talks in theory about, oh, we should change and we should do this, it's like, no, we need to like start over. It's not working, right? And I think that might be hard for some people to hear. And I certainly don't think it's like the individual, administrator's fault or like the teacher's certainly not their fault. Many of them are amazing. They're doing their best. It's an extremely noble thing to be like, I'm going to go teach in the Baltimore public schools after I graduate at 22 years old, just knowing what I'm going to go face. Not their fault at all. So if they're listening, that's not the blame. But the blame is like, we have to change this. Like we have to rip it apart, like we have to start over. We have to
yeah,
change
I mean
everything.
that makes me think about there was an averted school shooting plot in rural Tennessee last week, and it was a kid who uh basically had written manifestos saying that the situation was hopeless and just wanted to commit violence at the school. And when you look at the demographics of that community, the medium income is $21,000. The school has a 1% college admission rate, and it was one of the lowest scoring schools in every single category, despite being like 92% white in rural Tennessee. So this kid, I mean, what hope does he have? Like he lives in the most impoverished area at this high school that is not meeting the needs of any of the kids in that community in a railroad town that just collapsed when the coal industry fell apart. And we can't bring back the coal industry. That's terrible for 1,000 other reasons. But how does this kid have any hope going to that school every day where the teacher sucks, the curriculum sucks, he's not getting anything he needs to advance or have a job or go to college? And so he thinks a school shooting is his only way out of this in life, and that's a terrible place to be. But if he had one mentor or one program or something where people showed that they cared about him, then that might not ever happen. So I'll get you out of here on this. So you're 10 years into Guardian. What's your vision for 2035 for the program? You know, where you keep breaking the cycle and you keep expanding to more places. Where do you want this to be a decade from now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that truthfully, we got started with the idea that if we could just kind of help save one kid's life, change one kid's life, then that would be the success, right? And I think we've far surpassed that now, obviously. So that sometimes we have to kind of just take a step back and think, okay, it's easy to get wrapped up in the numbers and how many schools we have and how many kids we have, but really like the ultimate goal is like the impact. And I'd rather have 10 kids around the world that are like totally changing their life, breaking that cycle of failure, whatever it is, than just be able to say, oh, we have 500 kids training a day, right? That's not really like the goal and the statistic. It's really to change these individual lives. But I think, the more at bats we have, frankly, the better chance we have to do that. And so, from my perspective and kind of what I focus on is how to take the assets, the resources, the connections that we have and put them together in a way where we keep expanding the number of schools we have, where we keep expanding our donor base, because we're going to get more and more kids training, and a certain percentage of those are going to fall into that like high value, high quality, whatever you want to call it, bucket, where it really is the thing that maybe they stick with for the rest of their life. It's the thing that truly keeps them out of jail. It's the thing that keeps them out of a gang. It's the thing that keeps them from getting pregnant. It's the thing that keeps them from bullying the kid in school, all the things that everybody wants, whether they train jiu-jitsu or not. And so casting that wide net, giving that opportunity, and then changing like the individual, 10%, whatever it is, of the lives who come through the program.
Oh, and I have one more question for you. This is going to get off topic for just a tiny bit, but I've been curious, so I want to kind of put this out here. In addition to Guardian and everything that you're doing, you posted a picture a couple months ago sitting with Shabuzi in the kitchen. Is Shabuzi training at Guardian? What's the story with this?
No, so my buddy, one of my best friends, a guy named Davis, who lives in DC or lived in DC, he actually signed Shabuzi to his first record deal when nobody knew who Shabuzi was, and he just believed in him. He thought he was amazing. He thought he was a great talent. He actually recorded a lot of his first songs at Davis's studio in Los Angeles. And then he started to get noticed by the record labels, and Davis actually let him out of his contract. But before that, we went to LA one day. We were all in LA together, and Shabuzi, we went to ramen and got some food together. And this again was before he was famous. And I am friends with this guy named Andre Berto, who's like a pretty famous world champion boxer. And so we took Shabuzi over to Andre's house, which is, I think, the kitchen that you saw him in. And I kind of jokingly, not jokingly, I was like, Andre, this guy is going to be like super famous someday. Like, he's got an amazing talent. Andre's like friends with all these big time stars and Floyd Mayweathers and the Sean Combs and all these people. And he's just like, yeah, cool. Maybe, I've seen it before, right? Like, I've seen the, like, this guy's going to be famous in LA thing. And sure enough, like maybe 2 or 3 years after that picture was taken, he kind of just took off and become one of the biggest music stars in the world. And part of it is because my friend let him out of his contract. Like, if he would have been a jerk, it would have been a long, protracted legal battle. But he loved him and he loved his music so much that he was just like, I'm just going to do what's right for this guy, not what's right for me financially, which I thought was pretty cool.
Well, I mean, that story just kind of encapsulates this whole mentality of Guardian and believing in kids and trusting kids to be their own advocates and to learn something and to be able to be mentored and to be in environments where they can fight and wrestle and train, because what you just need to do is teach one kid who's on a bad path. Maybe it's the path to be a school shooter, maybe it's to be a gang member, maybe it's to get into drugs. If you just believe in one person, show that one person that they matter, then it has enormous downstream effects of saving society millions of dollars. And I mean, I think that that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing all over the U.S., in Ethiopia and Brazil, in Mongolia and Mexico, is just showing one kid that they matter, and that kid may have a profound impact on the world. So, Ben, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. Ben Kovacs is the founder of the Guardian Project. There's a link in the show notes to the Guardian Project. And, if you're able to, please donate. If you're not, please tell somebody. And, this was a little different from some of our other episodes, but we've got to be thinking outside of the box. We've got to say that a lot of the things in the status quo aren't working. And if we want to prevent violence, let's get back to the first principles and let's think of the simplest ways and the most cost-effective ways to get kids some help. Thank you for listening.